really, really bad news. The first Monday was 2 weeks ago. Today, my father passed away, a long bout with illness, passed away peacefully.
Mark Consuelos had everything: the career, the marriage, the family, the life most people only dream about. Then, one ordinary day, without any warning at all, news of tragedy arrived that changed him completely. The man people saw on screen every morning suddenly looked different behind closed doors. He was now quieter and looked heavier, like something had gone out in him. What did Mark Consuelos lose that broke him so completely at 55? And why has he never truly been the same since? Join us as we uncover the heartbreaking story behind the man the world thought they knew. The father who shaped Mark Consuelos. Mark Consuelos did not become the man he is by accident. The values he carried into his career, his marriage, and his family life came from somewhere. And that somewhere was home. And at the center of that home was his father. His father was not a loud or flashy man. He did not need to be. Because the kind of influence he had on Mark was the quiet kind. The kind that shapes a person slowly over years without making a big announcement about it. Things like discipline, loyalty, and the importance of showing up for the people who depend on you. These were not lessons delivered in long speeches. They were lessons lived out in front of him every single day. Mark grew up watching his father handle life with a steady calm. Nothing too dramatic, nothing reckless. Just a man who took his responsibilities seriously and expected the people around him to do the same. And that example stayed with Mark, even as he moved into a world that was loud and public and full of distraction. Those quiet lessons came with him everywhere he went. It is why, even at the height of his success, Mark never seemed interested in the more excessive parts of celebrity life. He stayed grounded, kept his circle tight, and protected what mattered most. And all of that traced back to his father and the foundation built long before any camera ever pointed in Mark's direction. Losing that man did not just mean losing a parent. It meant losing the original source of everything Mark had built his life around. And that kind of loss goes deeper than most people on the outside ever fully understand. And after his father's death, old memories suddenly began carrying a completely different emotional weight. Because grief has a way of turning ordinary moments into something that feels almost too painful to look back on. The memories. Mark could not escape. When someone close to you passes away, the memories do not stay quiet. They surface constantly, and they surface without asking permission. A song, a smell, an ordinary moment during the day, and suddenly you are somewhere else entirely, back inside a moment that no longer exists. That was what Mark was living with in the weeks that followed. His mind kept returning to moments spent with his father, conversations that had seemed unremarkable at the time, advice that had been given and not fully appreciated until now. Ordinary family moments that suddenly felt precious in a way they never had before. Grief does that. It takes the everyday and makes it feel significant. The things you never thought to hold on to become the things you reach for most. And Mark found himself replaying moments he had not thought about in years, times his father had shown up for him quietly without being asked, times he had said something simple that turned out to mean far more than Mark had realized in the moment. Those memories were comforting and painful at exactly the same time, because they were real and they were finished, and there would be no new ones to add to them ever again. That is one of the hardest parts of losing a parent. The relationship does not just end, it freezes. Everything that was said and done together becomes the complete collection, and you are left carrying it, knowing it will never grow any larger. Mark carried it quietly, turning it over the way people do when the grief is too private to share easily. And beneath all of it, something else was beginning to stir. Because beneath the sadness, another painful realization was quietly beginning to grow. One that had less to do with the loss itself, and more to do with the time that had already passed long before it. The regret that made the loss even harder. Grief is rarely just sadness. For a lot of people, it arrives with something else tucked underneath it, something quieter and harder to admit. And that something is regret. For Mark Consuelos, losing his father did not only bring pain about what had happened, it brought questions about what had not happened, about the years spent building a career, maintaining a public life, keeping up with the relentless pace of the industry he worked in, and about whether all of that had quietly taken time away from the person who mattered most. That is a question a lot of people never let themselves ask out loud, because the answer is uncomfortable. Success asks a lot of a person. It pulls at your attention, your energy, and your presence, and it rarely signals clearly when it is asking for too much. Mark had always been someone who valued family above everything else, but valuing something and always being fully present for it are not always the same thing, and the demands of a long career have a way of creating distance that nobody chose, and nobody fully noticed, until something happened that made it impossible to ignore. Mark was not the first person to feel this way after losing a parent, and he will not be the last. But knowing that does not make the feeling any easier to sit with. And as those emotions built inside him, people close to Mark noticed a side of him they had never seen before. A side that was quieter, more withdrawn, and carrying far more than he was willing to show the world. Mark Consuelos had always been the kind of person who kept himself together. He was calm, composed, and not someone who reached for attention when things got difficult. So when the grief settled in after losing his father, he did what people like him tend to do. He kept going, he kept showing up, and he kept it all contained on the outside. But the people closest to him could see something very different behind that composure. Because grief does not disappear simply because someone chooses not to talk about it. If anything, when it has nowhere to go, it tends to sit heavier. And for Mark, the pain was real and constant, even when nothing on the outside showed it. Quiet people often feel loss more deeply than others realize. Not because they are more sensitive than everyone else, but because they process things internally, turning them over again and again without releasing the pressure. And that kind of grief is exhausting in a way that is very hard to explain to someone who has not experienced it themselves. The small things became the hardest parts. A routine that now had a gap in it. A moment during the day when he would normally have called his father. A habit that had existed for decades and now had nowhere to go. Those ordinary reminders had a way of hitting harder than anyone expected. His public image remained steady because Mark made sure it did. He understood that there were people depending on him and responsibilities that did not pause for personal pain, but behind that steady image was a man who was emotionally exhausted and carrying far more than anyone watching from the outside could see. Mark was managing, and the effort it took to maintain that was quietly wearing him down. While he was struggling internally, Kelly Ripa quietly became his greatest source of strength because she saw exactly what was happening behind the composure, and she had no intention of looking the other way. Kelly Ripa refuses to leave his side. When things got hard, Kelly Ripa did not step back. She stepped closer. And that is not something everyone knows how to do, because when someone you love is grieving, the instinct is sometimes to give them space, to wait until they are ready to talk, to let them come to you in their own time. But Kelly seemed to understand that what Mark needed was not distance. He needed someone present, someone who was simply there, consistently, without making it feel complicated. She quietly shifted her focus entirely onto him, not in a dramatic or performative way, but in the small, practical ways that actually matter during difficult times. Checking in without pressure, sitting with him without needing to fill every silence, being available without making him feel like he had to manage her feelings about his pain on top of everything else he was already carrying. There is a particular kind of support that does not try to fix anything. It does not offer solutions or push someone to feel better, faster than they are capable of. It just holds steady and stays present. And that was exactly what Kelly offered Mark during this period, because she knew him well enough to understand that pushing him would only make him retreat further. They had been together long enough to know each other in that deep, quiet way that only comes with decades of real life shared together. She knew when to talk and when to say nothing at all. She knew that sometimes the most useful thing she could do was simply refuse to leave. She also gave him permission, without saying it directly, to stop pretending he was fine. And that matters more than most people realize. Being told by someone whose opinion genuinely counts to you that you do not have to hold it all together can be the thing that finally allows the grief to move. Mark leaned on her in ways he had perhaps never needed to before, and she carried that without complaint, without hesitation, and without making him feel small for needing it. During this painful period, the tragedy began changing Mark's entire outlook on life itself. Because some losses do not just pass through a person, they settle in and quietly shift the way that person sees absolutely everything. How losing his father changed Mark forever. Loss has a way of changing people in ways they do not always notice themselves. It happens gradually and quietly, through small shifts in how a person thinks, what they notice during the day, what starts to feel important, and what slowly stops mattering the way it used to. For Mark, the change was not dramatic or sudden. It was the kind of change that happens beneath the surface, visible only to the people who knew him well enough to notice the difference between who he was before and who he was becoming. He became more reflective, less caught up in the noise of the industry around him, more likely to pause before speaking, to sit with things rather than rush past them. And the things that had once filled his days with a sense of urgency began to feel much smaller when placed next to what he had just been through. That is not uncommon after a significant loss. When something that was always there is suddenly gone, it forces a person to look more honestly at what remains, and the priorities that had always seemed fixed begin to quietly rearrange themselves without the person even choosing for that to happen. Losing a parent in particular carries a specific kind of weight, because a parent is often the person who existed in your life before anything else did, before the career, before the marriage, before the public version of yourself ever came into existence. And when that person is gone, something shifts in how you understand your own place in the world. Mark had always been someone who valued family and connection above the trappings of success. But grief has a way of sharpening that instinct until it becomes impossible to ignore. The career and the public profile, and all the demands that came with it, became easier to put into perspective once something genuinely irreplaceable had been taken away. He was not broken by what happened, but he was changed by it, quietly and permanently. At the same time, millions of fans watching from the outside suddenly saw Mark in a completely different light. Because when someone the public has followed for decades is visibly carrying real pain, people feel it in a way that goes far beyond celebrity news. Why the world felt heartbroken for him. There is something particular about watching someone you have grown up seeing on television go through something genuinely painful. It does not feel the same as reading about a stranger. It feels closer than that, even if you have never been in the same room as them or exchanged a single word. Mark Consuelos had been a familiar face for a long time. People had watched him across different chapters of his career, seen him alongside Kelly on morning television, followed the milestones of his family life in the way that audiences naturally do with people they feel they have come to know. And that kind of long familiarity creates a connection that is quiet, but very real. So when news of the loss began to spread, the reaction was not the usual brief flicker of celebrity sympathy that disappears within a day or two. People were genuinely affected. Comments and messages reflected real emotion rather than performance. People shared their own experiences of losing a parent, connected Mark's situation to moments from their own lives, and found something in his story that had absolutely nothing to do with fame at all. That is what happens when grief is presented honestly and without drama. It stops being about who the person is and starts being about what they are going through. And losing a parent is one of the most universally understood forms of pain that exists because almost every person either has faced it or knows that one day they will. Mark had never been the kind of celebrity who performed emotion for attention or shared pain for sympathy, and that quiet authenticity was exactly why people responded the way they did. They could sense that what he was going through was real, and real pain handled with dignity tends to move people far more than anything loud or dramatic ever could. The world did not just feel sorry for him, they saw themselves in him. But the most powerful part of the story was not the sadness. It was what the loss ultimately taught him. And inside all of that grief, something important and lasting was quietly beginning to take shape. Grief has a way of teaching things that nothing else can. Not success, not experience, not even time itself. And for Mark, the loss of his father carried a lesson that settled in slowly and quietly changed the way he saw almost everything around him. The lesson was simple, but it was not easy to sit with. Fame means very little when the people who shaped you are no longer there. All the career achievements, the recognition, the years of hard work, none of it filled the space his father had left behind. And that realization landed on Mark in a way that was quiet, but permanent. He began leaning more heavily into the relationships still around him. His wife, his children, the people his father had always encouraged him to hold close. He became more present, more intentional, and less willing to let the noise of work pull his attention away from what actually mattered most. There is a kind of emotional understanding that only arrives through loss. It cannot be rushed or borrowed from someone else. It has to be lived through, and Mark was living through it quietly, without any announcement, simply becoming someone who understood far more clearly what life was actually for. He stopped waiting for the right moment to be fully present, because his father's passing had shown him plainly that the right moment is never guaranteed. And in the end, the tragedy revealed the real Mark Consuelos more clearly than fame ever could, because what loss takes away, it also clarifies. And what it clarified about Mark was something quietly powerful and deeply human. The heartbreaking truth about life and time. Fame is a strange thing. It can make a person seem untouchable, as if the ordinary heartbreaks that visit everyone else somehow pass right by the people living in the public eye. But they do not. They never do. And Mark Consuelos, at 55, was a quiet reminder of exactly that. Underneath the career, the television appearances, and the familiar face, There was simply a man facing one of the hardest things any person can go through: the loss of a parent, the kind of absence that does not fill back in no matter how much time passes or how full life becomes around it. What his father's passing forced Mark to confront was something most people spend their lives trying to avoid thinking about. That time moves whether you are paying attention or not. That the people who shaped you will not always be there. And that no level of success can slow any of that down. He kept going, leaning on Kelly, holding his family close, carrying the grief in the quiet and steady way that had always defined him, not loudly, not dramatically, just honestly, and with as much grace as the pain would allow. The story of Mark Consuelos is not really a celebrity story at all. It is a human one, about love, loss, time, and the people who shape us into who we are before the world ever gets to meet us. At 55, Mark Consuelos was not just mourning the loss of his father. He was facing the painful realization that no amount of success can stop time from taking away the people who once helped shape our entire world. If you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe, and also click the next video shown on your screen.